Ever since Xi Jinping took power in 2013, China has undergone a dramatic military transformation. With the world's largest navy, advanced missiles, and around 500 nuclear weapons, China's military might is undeniable. But why this relentless build-up? Is it merely about extending geopolitical influence, a logical pursuit for any rising power? With military might comes a stronger voice in international negotiations, but the true motive runs deeper: territorial control. China's ambitions extend beyond mere influence. The desire to reclaim territories, like Taiwan and the South China Sea, drives its expansion. These artificial islands in the South China Sea aren't just symbols, they're military fortresses, strategically positioned to dominate crucial maritime routes. But what does this mean for the world? How would global trade be affected if China controlled these waters? And what if the US decided to challenge Beijing's grip? In this video, we explore the strategic importance of these islands, why China built them, and what could happen if the US Navy took control. First, let's uncover why the South China Sea is so crucial to China and the world. According to China, its claim to the South China Sea dates back to the Han Dynasty. Lasting between 206 BC and 220 AD, the Han Dynasty was the first to record shipborne voyages through this body of water, as it was the Han Dynasty emperors who sent out explorers to investigate and chart other parts of Asia that lay beyond China's land borders. These voyages continued into the Song Dynasty, at which point China started to claim and name territory in the South China Sea. Key among these scraps of territory are the Spratly Islands, which China calls Nansha, and the Paracel Islands. The former are important to remember, as they are relevant to the artificial islands China has invested so much into building. As trade took China's explorers deeper into Southeast Asia, Beijing claims historical records show that China had almost complete control over the South China Sea. That control lasted until the 19th century, when a combination of the rise of Vietnam's Nguyen dynasty and the arrival of more Western explorers led to challenges over Chinese supremacy in the South China Sea. Vietnamese and European claims were eventually pushed out by Japan, which had become increasingly militarized in the 19th century, focusing most of its efforts on taking China. By 1942, Japan controlled several Chinese cities and much of Southeast Asia, and had occupied most of the countries that surrounded the South China Sea. Japan's control lasted until the end of World War II, in which it was roundly defeated by the Allies. It's in the aftermath of Japan's defeat that so much of today's conflicts finds its source. China clearly believed that the South China Sea should pass back into its control, bolstered by its historical claims to the waters. However, maritime law dictates that much of the sea falls under no nation's control, meaning it should be free to use for commercial and military vessels. China disputes this, and has done so many times by creating maps containing the 9-dash line. This line visualizes China's territorial claims in the South China Sea, outlining many of the islands and rocks within the waters over which China claims territorial sovereignty. It also covers waters over which China believes it has some measure of historic rights, based on the actions of the Han and Song dynasties, as well as China's interpretation of the maritime zones created by the Law of the Sea, drafted by the United Nations Convention. The 9 dashes extend from the south of China, running essentially parallel to Vietnam's coast, before arching around to the Spratly Islands, to run across the coasts of Malaysia and the Philippines. The final line arcs slightly northeast, reinforcing China's claim over Taiwan. By now you're probably asking what any of this has to do with artificial islands. The answer lies in maritime law, and specifically the Spratly Islands. As Royal Museums Greenwich points out, maritime law says that countries are allowed to create exclusive economic zones, or EEZs, that extend up to 200 nautical miles from their coastlines. Within these EEZs, the countries have complete control over the passage of ships and aircraft, with that control ending outside the EEZ. That's a problem for China. With EEZs alone, China only controls a small portion of the South China Sea, with Vietnam, Malaysia, and the Philippines also having EEZs extending from their coasts. The bulk of the sea is controlled by none of these countries. It falls outside of the EEZs and is thus subject to international maritime law rather than any specific country's laws. China wants to change that, which brings us to its artificial islands. Between December 2013 and October 2015, China built a trio of artificial islands totaling around 3,000 acres in size on a collection of 7 coral reefs within the South China Sea. Key here is that these reefs are based within the Spratly Islands, over which China lays claim despite those islands being closer to Malaysia, Vietnam, and the Philippines than they are to China. Crucially, the Spratly Islands, which are perhaps more accurately described as a collection of large rocks and uninhabitable islands that are positioned almost in the center of the South China Sea. It's the perfect place to build artificial islands and make claims on existing ones to allow China to create the EEZs needed to control the waters that lie beyond its mainland borders. The construction of these islands has been controversial from the beginning. Dubbed the Great Wall of Sand by some commentators, including US Pacific Fleet Commander Admiral Harry Harris, who coined the term in April 2015, the islands are far from the first of their kind. For instance, Japan built the artificial island of Odaiba off the coast of Tokyo Bay in the 1850s, showcasing that the concept is not only old, but has been prominent in the Indo-Pacific in the past. However, China's approach to building its islands has been far different from that of other countries. As the US-China Economic and Security Review Commission notes, the scale and speed of China's operations have caused untold damage to the coral reefs on which the islands are built. Fisheries in the immediate area of the islands were also disrupted during construction, with the Commission noting that China would likely use these islands to cause further fishing disruption in the future. But these are far from the only concerns the rest of the world has about China's artificial islands. Far more worrying is that China has spent the last few years militarizing its man-made land masses. In March 2022, The Guardian, a UK newspaper, published a report in which it claimed that China has fully militarized at least 3 of the artificial islands it's built near the Spratlys. The artificial islands are now equipped with anti-aircraft and anti-ship defenses, in addition to hosting Chinese fighter jets and being equipped with both laser and jamming equipment. The move flies in the face of past claims by President Xi that China wouldn't turn its artificial islands into military bases, as pointed out by Admiral John C. Aquilino, who serves with the US Indo-Pacific Fleet. He claims that China is now using its islands to flex its military muscle, claiming they have advanced all their capabilities and that buildup of weaponization is destabilizing the region. That brings us to another thing we need to consider when contemplating a US Navy takeover of these islands. Why has China built them in the first place? We've already explored one of the answers. Through its artificial islands, China aims to assert its claim over the Spratly Islands and, by extension, its claim to govern almost the entire South China Sea. That much was made clear in Aquilino's comments on the militarization of the islands and what happened when the US flew a P-8A Poseidon plane over the Spratly Islands. It quickly received a message stating, "China has sovereignty over the Spratly Islands, as well as surrounding maritime areas. Stay away immediately to avoid misjudgment." That sovereignty isn't recognized by the rest of the world, with the plane's pilot radioing back that he was flying a sovereign-immune United States naval aircraft conducting lawful military activities beyond the national airspace of any coastal state. According to international maritime law, the pilot is correct. China has no claim over the Spratly Islands. However, Aquilino points out that flying over them or sailing near them places a plane or ship within range of Chinese missile installations on its artificial islands. Through its artificial islands, China is artificially reinforcing a claim to sovereignty over the South China Sea that the rest of the world says it doesn't have. If it can somehow have these islands recognized under maritime law, it'll be able to create EEZs around them, thus giving it more control over ships that can travel through the South China Sea. But that's not all. The artificial islands also allow it to maintain a consistent threat to several other countries that dispute China's claim to the Spratly Islands. According to the Central Intelligence Agency, or CIA, China is far from the only nation that claims all or at least a portion of the Spratly Islands. The islands, which number about 100 when accounting for large rocks and coral reefs, are also claimed in their entirety by Vietnam and Taiwan. Malaysia and the Philippines also claim a portion of the 100 islands, making them disputed territories. That's clear from the military forces installed on the islands themselves. The CIA points out that 45 of the Spratly Islands contain small numbers of soldiers from each of the 5 countries that claim it, essentially creating a standoff within the islands themselves. Brunei also threw itself into the mix in 1985. It claims a continental shelf overlapping the Spratly Islands' southern reef, though it makes no claims on the islands themselves. The point here is that the Spratly Islands have been the site of military posturing by 5 different nations for several decades. By building artificial islands within the vicinity of the Spratly Islands, China can bolster its military presence in ways the other countries can't. They have small units stationed on tiny islands. China now has 3,000 acres from which it can conduct missile strikes, launch aircraft, and jam up an enemy's systems. There's a clear threat being made to Malaysia, Vietnam, Taiwan, and the Philippines here, and it's a threat that none of those countries can return. They don't have the resources needed to build artificial islands of their own. Other reasons for China building these islands are more practical. For instance, China gaining sovereignty over the Spratly Islands region wouldn't just give it control over much of the South China Sea, it would also enable access to extensive oil and gas deposits. The US Energy Information Administration, or EIA, estimates that the Spratly Islands region has oil deposits that range between 0.9 billion and 3 billion barrels. Add to that the potential of natural gas deposits. There could be anywhere between none and 16.2 trillion cubic feet in the Spratly Islands, and it's obvious why China would want to control them. They would give it a chance at some semblance of energy independence. China imported 11.3 million barrels of crude oil per day in 2023, highlighting how dependent the country is on others and their natural resources. Assuming that same rate of consumption, controlling the Spratlys via their artificial islands gives China access to enough oil to last for 265 days. It's not much, but it could go at least some way to helping Beijing to wean itself off from its suppliers. Plus, establishing sovereignty over the Spratlys could strengthen China's claim over the South China Sea, a region that may contain up to 9.2 billion barrels, according to the EIA. Even if China doesn't use that oil for itself, it gains access to reserves and resources it can use to turn a tidy profit. Perhaps the reasons for China's territorial claims are becoming clearer. However, its artificial islands also serve an important purpose for China's military. As tensions rise with its neighbors that border the South China Sea, China likely feels that it needs to be ready for a possible fight with any of them. The artificial islands play a role in that readiness simply by being military bases from which attacks can be launched. However, they also play a key supporting role in China's strategy in the South China Sea. They would be used to refuel the country's aircraft. In terms of sheer size, China has the world's third largest air force, numbering 3,304 aircraft, 2,478 of them of which are combat-ready according to global firepower. It poses more than enough of a threat to establish aerial dominance over the South China Sea if war broke out between it and any other nations that contest the Spratlys. However, there's a weakness in China's air force. Though it's invested heavily in building fighter jets and helicopters, China only has 10 planes in its tanker fleet. These planes are important because they allow other aircraft to refuel while in the air, extending the range of those aircraft while also cutting down on the time losses that come from having to land and refuel. The United States understands the importance of a strong tanker fleet in 21st century warfare, which is why it has 606 of these types of aircraft. China is a long way behind the curve when it comes to aerial refueling, even though it's developing the Zhan Y-20 to expand its aerial refueling capabilities. For now at least, China will require its planes to land to take on fuel, meaning a combination of its aircraft carriers and the bases it's built on its artificial islands are essential to its potential wartime strategy. So far, we've discovered why China believes it has a territorial claim over both the South China Sea and the Spratly Islands upon which it's built its artificial ones. We also know that the artificial islands have been militarized, despite Xi's claims that they wouldn't be, and that China intends to use them to expand its sovereignty and threaten other nations. Now we come to the big question: what would happen if the United States took control of China's artificial islands? To answer that, we first need to understand the extent to which the islands have been militarized and how the US perceives these islands. Writing for War on the Rocks in January 2020, Center for Strategic and International Studies, or CSIS, Senior Fellow Gregory B. Poling discussed China's artificial islands. An expert in South China Sea affairs, Poling suggests that the US was operating under the mistaken belief that it could easily neutralize China's artificial islands if the time came when that was needed. That assumption is false, according to Poling. He says that the islands would allow China to control both the waters and air over the South China Sea during the early stages of any conflict between the US and China, noting that the initial US response would be limited to using submarines. Poling notes that China has already started using its artificial islands to offer support to the dozens of ships it had conducting operations and simply sailing through the South China Sea to threaten its neighbors. He calls this peacetime coercion, reinforcing that China intends to use its islands to push the likes of Vietnam and Malaysia toward giving up their maritime rights to Beijing once it becomes the dominant force in the South China Sea. Then he dug deeper into the militarization of the three islands. CSIS analysis suggests that China's artificial islands, named Fiery Cross, Subi Reefs, and the cheekily entitled Mischief, contain 72 fighter jet hangars between them. He also notes that these aren't the only three islands America would have to consider. Another, named Woody Island, lies in the Paracels region and contains another 16 fighter jet hangars. These hangars would make China the first mover in any naval conflict with the US in the South China Sea, as it could either station jets at the islands or easily fly them over to use its artificial islands as bases from which it can establish aerial superiority. China also has defenses in place to fight against the ships the US might send. These include the YJ-12B and YJ-62 anti-ship missile systems, which Poling says are present on all of China's artificial islands. Both are major threats to American vessels. The YJ-12B is capable of carrying a conventional or nuclear warhead weighing up to 1,100 pounds, and it has a range of about 285 miles. That's more than enough range to strike an American ship that comes within the EEZ China wants to establish around its islands, making a ground invasion via boat more challenging. The YJ-62 isn't quite as powerful or rangy. It can travel up to 248 miles and weighs 462 pounds with its warhead attached. It packs less of a punch, but it's still capable of causing damage to American ships. Add long-range missiles fired from the Chinese mainland, and the US Navy and US Air Force may face concentrated missile barrages as they try to take China's artificial islands. The US also wouldn't have the element of surprise. That's where the radar systems installed on China's artificial islands come into play. They'll help Beijing see any traffic through the South China Sea, which is why the US will struggle to launch a preemptive above-surface attack. It'll have to approach the battle as though China knows it's coming, meaning it'll need to prepare for losses. Does that mean the US couldn't win? Not according to polling. He says that the US will be able to take the artificial islands, though doing so would come at a cost that America may not want to accept. Assuming that it does accept the cost, America will find that its aircraft carriers are less helpful than it would hope for them to be. Positioning them anywhere near the islands puts them in range of missiles, both from the islands themselves and from the Chinese mainland. So those carriers would likely be stationed within the Celebes or Sulu Seas, with the US aerial approach instead making heavy use of its tanker fleet. Though the artificial islands have anti-air defenses, these would likely focus on incoming fighter jets and bombers. To gain aerial dominance, the US would have to fight through any jets China launches from its islands, likely making progress in small increments so it can secure aerial space for its tankers to occupy. From there, the US could continue gaining aerial territory, using those tankers to refuel while knowing that China has a limited capacity to do the same. Massive amounts of ordnance would also likely be required to disable the island's bases. As polling points out, the US strike on Syria's Shayrat air base in 2017 involved 59 Tomahawk missiles, with 58 of those missiles hitting their targets. Despite this success, the base's runway was operational again in a matter of hours. The presence of HQ-9 surface-to-air missiles on the islands also means they have some defenses from an American missile barrage. So the US strategy here would likely involve it attempting to arrange its naval and aerial assets in such a way that it could carry out concerted and repeated missile strikes on the artificial islands. In doing so, it will lose ships due to return fire from the islands and the Chinese mainland. Alternatively, the US could focus on hitting key information nodes in the bases. Polling estimates that this approach would require about 100 missiles per base, amounting to 400 in total when including Woody Island, and that it would be enough to essentially cripple the bases. Those missiles would be safest being fired from American submarines to limit ship casualties, but even that approach comes with problems. Given that China would know that the US was coming, it would deploy a large above-water fleet to the South China Sea to tie up those submarines in naval battles. Realistically, the 400 missiles needed to take out the island's information nodes would be the bare minimum. The US would likely need several hundred more to clear a path for its submarines to get within range. The US does have other options though. Take its trilateral security arrangement with South Korea and Japan as an example. Though that agreement doesn't obligate those nations to step in and fight alongside the US as it attempts to take China's islands, both would benefit from a reduced Chinese presence in the South China Sea. The caveat to this is that both might also become future targets of China, facing Beijing's retribution for their part in taking the islands. This would mean the US would have to commit to maintaining its strong presence in the Indo-Pacific. Bringing Japan and South Korea into the mix would add a substantial naval force to the assault on China's islands, giving the US more options when it comes to overwhelming the island's collective defenses. There's another country that could come into play, the Philippines. The US has an enhanced defense cooperation agreement with the Philippines, which US Secretary of State Blinken called ironclad in March 2024. Through this agreement, the US could leverage both Besa Air Base and Antonio Batista Air Base to fight against China's aerial dominance over the South China Sea, according to polling in his peaceful war on the rocks. Thus, the US receives a safe place from which its planes can take off. China won't attack the Philippines unless it intends to start an all-out war in the South China Sea. This alliance eliminates the need for US air carriers to put themselves at risk in the South China Sea. America can simply rotate forces in the Philippines as needed. So the US has a path to victory in the fight for China's artificial islands. That leaves us with one more question. What would the US do once it took control of these islands? Here is where things get a little murky, for the simple fact that many would argue China's artificial islands are illegal. The US may face pressure from the wider geopolitical community to simply deactivate the islands, likely by destroying them entirely, to ensure they can't be used by any other nation to stake a claim over the Spratlys or the wider South China Sea. That's a solution that would likely satisfy international maritime law. Each country contesting the South China Sea would essentially go back to where it was before the islands were built. Of course, there would be the bonus of reducing China's military presence in the area, thus taking away its implied threats to the likes of Malaysia, Vietnam, and the Philippines. However, the Philippines could throw a wrench in that plan. Remember that it believes it owns a portion of the Spratly Islands. If it cooperates with the United States to allow the US to use its air bases to establish aerial dominance, it may look for a little quid pro quo. After all, the country would put itself at risk of Chinese aggression, both during the island takeover and into the future. Perhaps it would ask for control of the islands, a fair price in Philippines' eyes, and one that would grant the country with its own measure of control in the South China Sea. That solution comes with problems. Not only would the islands still exist, allowing China to try and take them again in the future, but geopolitical tensions would rise between the Philippines and its neighbors. After all, Malaysia, Taiwan, and Vietnam all lay at least partial claim to the Spratly Islands. Handing China's artificial islands to the Philippines would only create more disputes because those islands provide more control over the Spratlys. Perhaps an alliance of some sort is the best solution. Upon taking control of China's artificial islands, the US could broker a deal in which all countries that lay claim to the Spratlys, barring China, could maintain a contingent of their forces on the artificial islands. Of course, the US itself would join this deal. That would essentially create an alliance between the US, the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, and Taiwan, with all 5 nations presenting a united front against China in the Indo-Pacific, using the very islands that China built. That may be the reason why the US would attack China's artificial islands, even though it would stand to lose those assets and expend munitions to do so. The alliances that it could build in the wake of the attack, which could supplement its current defensive arrangements with Japan, South Korea, and the Philippines, may be strong enough to grant it more influence in the Indo-Pacific. But what do you think? Would the US be able to take China's artificial islands, and if so, at what cost? What do you believe would happen to those islands should America succeed? Share your thoughts in the comments, and thank you for watching the video. Now go and check out why China's man-made islands are a disaster, or click this other video instead.